interpreters here, Stephanie and Sean. So hopefully if anybody needs those services, we have them. And we also have translators here for both Spanish and Chinese. Ming Zhang. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you, Ming. And Pauline Claremont up there. So if anybody would like or need those services, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to make those arrangements for everybody. To begin with, the meeting today, we have two sessions, 4 to 6. The first hour or so of the 2 to 4 is going to be the presentation, but we're hoping to have a lot of question and answers. And for that, we have provided and hope that folks will use the comment cards. So if you have questions as we go through the presentation, we would encourage you to please write them onto the comment card. And then if you need more comment cards, we have several extras. We can hand those out too. So we'll have Regan from our planning division up here can come and provide more if you need them. So to the extent that you have comments, please let us know. And if you could, please try to write legibly, because we'll sort through those and go through those comment cards at the end as a question and answer section of the meeting. So with that, I just would like to advance the group. Thank everybody for participating today. And also, if anybody doesn't have the time to kind of dig into the report that we released that's on our website in greater detail, we do have a pamphlet back there, and we are making translations on this pamphlet for multiple languages, and we'll be posting these onto our website as well. The public feedback is, of course, a very key part of the core civil works process. And to speak to that issue, we have our commander of the New York District, Colonel Matthew Lozado here. Thank you, sir, for attending, and the stage is yours.
I'll put down arrow for the slides.
Yes.
All right. Hey, my name is Colonel Matt Lozado. I'm the commander of the New York District Corps of Engineers. And in the Army, the commander's responsibility is to be at the location of the most important mission that unit has ongoing at the time. And I will tell you that this public session is the most important thing I have going on in the district right now, to ensure that we get the comments that we need to improve this study so we build the best project possible if authorized and funded. So I'm here to emphasize and point out also, I want to thank my team, first of all. Anybody you see with a tag on is either part of the New York District, one of our non-federal sponsors, or part of the contracting team that is supporting us. And you can tell by the number of folks that we have here in that capacity, the level of effort that we're putting into this. And I hope you acknowledge and appreciate that, because we have 3 primary goals here, is to increase that dialogue, to empower the public, and to ensure accountability on how we execute what we do. And by doing that, hopefully we can improve the study overall. So I'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the meeting, again, to provide information about the harbor and tributary study in general, to provide information about the draft feasibility report, the Tier 1 environmental statement, provide an overview of the tentatively selected plan, and I'll talk a little bit about exactly what that means in a second, and hear your feedback with regards to those, because that's the main reason we're here. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the study background, the planning process, the important considerations we took into account, evaluating the alternative plans, and then the plan that we've tentatively selected. We'll go over that overview, provide that feedback, and then have a Q&A session at the end. So there's 4 key important notes that I need you guys to all understand. This is a preliminary concept of a plan. It is not final. Everything is on the table with regards to how we can adjust or modify this plan. It is purely tentative. And that is why we ask you all to join us and provide us comments so that we can adjust it at this time, because this is the time that we can make those changes. Further in the process, once these things get authorized by Congress and funded by Congress, those opportunities for those changes get smaller and smaller. So we need that from you. and just to remind you, this project is not yet funded or approved by Congress. You know, they have authorized the Corps of Engineers to go out and conduct a study. So they first give us the authority. I don't do anything unless Congress tells me to do it. And first they give us the authority and the funding to conduct a study. We conduct that study, then we bring the results back to them in what's called the Chief's Report, and then we hand that back off to Congress, and they choose whether or not they will fund it or authorize it. So we are before that authorization and funding portion of this project. So in other words, we're still a ways away. So there is no pending construction effort right now. Nobody needs to worry about when are the dozers going to show up outside my house. We are far, far away from that, and that's why we're seeking this input now, because we are still so far away from that. So we are back here in the planning phase. Okay, we still have design and construction to get to. Those are long phases, and I've got another slide here that lays it out a little bit more. So, how are we getting everybody the information that they need so they can provide valuable information? Well, we do that through meetings like this, but we also have information presented online that some of you saw outside there, which basically gives you the ability to take our 4,000 or so page document, and for those of you who may not want to read that entire thing, we've done a couple of things. We've tried to create a website that gives you the ability to understand where the information is and help you find what you are looking for without having to dig through it all yourself. So you'll see that we provide that opportunity. You go to that website, and I even tested it myself. I'm like, okay, how would I find this if I was a general public? I would type in New York Corps of Engineers study, and it comes up pretty easily. This website will come up. And if anything, Corps of Engineers, hats, stuff like that, it pops right up and you can go right to it. So what we've created is a reader's guide for those of you that want to delve directly into the study itself. So we give you that opportunity to be able to click and take it to the exact chapter that you're interested in to help you find the information that you need, because we don't want people just sifting through 4,000 pages of information, unless you want to. And then we took it a step further and we've created a story map. And this is something that we're really doing for the first time with this study because it is so large and comprehensive, is try to create, a GIS-based interactive website that allows people to go in and you can actually type in your home address in this. It will take you to that location and it will show you what features of the tentatively selected plan are near you. So you can have an idea of what portions of this plan may impact your community. And then that way you can better be guided in how you provide us feedback. So we're doing this in multiple languages, but we also know that not everybody has access to internet. So that's why we try to provide the multi-language brochures as well. If you know folks that would need that information, we encourage you to take as many as you want. You're also able to download those. Are they able to download those? If they're not, we're going to be able to. We'll make sure that they're on the website so you can download those multi-language brochures to access those. And then finally, public opportunities like this to put out information. We work closely with non-governmental organizations and interest groups to ensure that we pick locations that have great public transportation. We try to do multiple meetings, like today we're doing one during the daytime hours, but one in the evening as well, because we know people work and we want to be able to get both folks who are here maybe on an official capacity, but then also people who can come here after work and join us and get the same information without being inhibited by that. And we will have many of these engagements. So yes, within that hub you'll see those multiple opportunities to get that information, compare alternatives, the real estate easements, where the environmental justice areas are of concern that we're trying to address. All of that is within the story map, to include renderings. There was a significant call to provide as many renderings as possible. We can talk about things like seawalls and stuff like that, but it has a much more greater impact if you're able to see what that potentially could look like. So, 3, your feedback is extremely important to us. We're creating all these opportunities to be able to receive this feedback, this is just one in a series of meetings. So again, the focus being on creating a dialogue with the public. That's what we're trying to achieve right here. Making sure that you hold me accountable as the commander of the New York District Corps of Engineers, that we are doing what is supposed to be done as far as public engagement, and then ensuring that we empower you to provide us that feedback. Okay, so I added a couple slides to this, much to my team's chagrin, although I think they're I'm a PowerPoint guy, bear with me, this is what the Army does. So I wanted to lay out and kind of explain a little bit more what our process looks like, and try to point out all the opportunities for public engagement where they exist. Because some of you, this might be your first public meeting. You may not know that we held 2 previous public meeting sessions in 2017 when we were first authorized to do the study. We went out to the public then and we said, hey, Congress told us to do a study. What should we study? And we received feedback at that point. Then we went and we conducted a portion of the study and we determined multiple alternatives. And we came back to the public and we said, hey, we've developed all these alternatives. What do you think about these alternatives? You provided us feedback then. Now we've tentatively selected one of those alternatives based on how we analyze things, benefit-cost ratio and other such things, environmental justice, environmental impact, all those sorts of things. And we've said, hey, we've tentatively selected option 3 Bravo. What do you think about that? And that's where we are today. We want to hear your feedback on what you think about this tentative plan. And again, everything is on the table. Now is the time to give us that feedback. All right, once we get to construction and authorization, our ability to make changes becomes limited. So that's why these meetings are so important. So those 2 opportunities have been prioritized. Right now we're at the yellow star. I'm receiving your feedback today. Going forward, we will then be able to select a plan and issue that in a chief's report to Congress, and they will choose whether or not they fund or authorize some or all of this study. Now, one thing I always like to point out is that public engagement is not just through meetings like this. It also comes with your vote. I don't do anything unless Congress tells me to do it. Your congressional members have a great amount of authority and power in what I do. And trust me, they let me know that. And guess what? They listen to you guys. So writing letters to your congressman is a very effective tool. Okay, so I encourage you to also seek that route that is provided through you through our American democratic system. All right? Then as we move into the pre-engineer and design phase of the project, that's when we start getting into, all right, what are we going to build? How are we going to build it? What are the various impacts? And we have requirements within NEPA to have yet another public engagement meeting. And this next one will be on the entire scope of the project, whatever was authorized. All right? Because in the future, there's yet another opportunity. You see all those smaller public comment periods where for each project, and as you see in this, there's many different projects associated with this study. We're going to execute these phases at a time, a piece at a time. We're going to do this barrier, and then we're going to do that seawall. This is going to take a long period of time to construct. And that's why you see this timeline going out to construction completion not until about 2046. This is a long-term plan. And so as we develop those plans for each of those projects, we're again going to seek public comment on how and what we're building specifically for that portion of the project. And you're going to have an opportunity to engage with us on that as well. And then finally, when we're actually about to have the bulldozers show up or plant the seagrass out in the ocean for some wave attenuation project, you will have an opportunity to hear what the plan is, what the impacts may be, because we want to make sure that the community knows what and how we're going to construct this so that you have an idea what the timeline looks like, how are you going to be impacted, because we know construction is disruptive. But in order to build these kind of things, we have to go through that process, and we're going to seek public feedback then as well. All right, so many opportunities for public feedback. All right, so I've heard this criticism in the past. You're the federal government, you're checking a block because Congress told you you have to have public engagement, you're just going to receive our comments, and you're not going to take them into account. So it's my responsibility to tell you how we actually do that. So if you look at this, on the left-hand side, all those black dots are the thousands of public comments we will receive. All right? Our job then is to take all of those and review them and say, okay, where are there common themes, concerns, or ideas that potentially could be incorporated into this plan? And we batch those together and try to say, hey, this is a good, concise idea, and we've been able to bring all these comments together to kind of create this concept. We bring those together, and then we look for those common ideas, those are those represented by the color dots, that we've extracted from the thousands of comments we received. But then we have a responsibility of a lot of requirements we have to meet before we can actually incorporate them into the study. It has to be legal. It has to, be within our own authorization. Does the technology exist to actually do it? Does it impact somebody else negatively? Sometimes there are comments that, hey, why don't you do this? And the answer is, well, it makes it worse for your neighbor. It may make it better for you, but it may make it worse for your neighbor. And that has to be, if we can't mitigate it, it has to be screened out as an idea. So ultimately, after we go through all this and make sure it's equitable, it doesn't have any negative impact on cultural, historical sites, local economy, viewshed, traffic patterns. I mean, there's an infinite number of variables that we have to account for to try to incorporate these comments. And in the end, we come out with some really good nuggets that you guys have provided us that make it through and are feasible to include in the plan. And then we incorporate them in. But what I will say is not every comment can be incorporated because maybe it cannot, it may not be legal, it may cause challenges for somebody else, it may impart difficulty on a cultural site, things like that. But our responsibility is, and something that we have not done very well, is how do we come back to you and say, how has your feedback assisted us? And so this is my first attempt right now is to let you know, we've already been meeting with many interest groups out there, and they've already given us a lot of feedback on how we're doing this process right now. First was, they said we didn't give you guys enough time to give public feedback. They sent us a letter, we went ahead and we extended the duration another 60 days to get us out to March 7th. That was directly a result of public feedback. The overall improvement to the web design, they had some harsh critiques on how we've developed that, and we're continuing to improve that, and we're continuing to take feedback, and we've made those improvements. Comments on how and when and where we conduct public meetings, we've incorporated those. And then seeking those comments that are common across the community from local leaders and reaching out to those local leaders. And finally, developing communications that helps the community better understand the process we have to go through. These all came directly from public comment. All right? To include some statements I made today that came directly from folks in this audience right now. It's real-time change, Paul. So real-time change. And so I say that because I emphasize the importance of this public comment. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the experts, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, sir. I will just be giving a little bit of a background on the study. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging our wonderful non-federal partners that the Colonel mentioned. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection have been our sponsors on this study. The study was started back in 2016, July of 2016, and they, until July of this year, have been contributing 50% of the overall study cost. So the study area is shown here on the graphic. On the left side here, you can see the study area encompasses all of New York City, all the tributaries to the head of tide, and a lot of the coastally affected communities in urbanized northern New Jersey. So it's one of, if not the largest, focus area study that was born out of the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study that the Corps did immediately following Hurricane Sandy. That study was completed in 2015. This study was identified as a focus area because it had not been evaluated previously comprehensively by the Corps for coastal storm risk. So while we have a number of projects within this study area, it's never been evaluated comprehensively, and even though there have been a number of projects, which I'll speak to later, that have been done since Hurricane Sandy in this area, as we'll show you in this presentation, there still is an enormous amount of coastal storm risk that faces this region today, and that risk will only get worse into the future with sea level rise and climate change. So since 2016, we've had a couple series of public engagements, the scoping meetings back in 2017, the interim report meetings that we had back in 2019, and we've tried to incorporate a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from the public from those engagements in terms of the alternatives that we've considered and some of the concerns related to those various alternatives. The study has been scoped currently at 19.4 million, so in the Corps' vernacular, it's been designated a mega study, which involves a lot more engagement with our vertical team, which can help us resolve some policy issues and help the project move along smoothly. It's also been given an extended time period. Unfortunately, we did get paused effectively in 2020 and 21. So the study has been extended just this last year to have a current completion date of 2024. We might need to get a few amendments to that because the extended comment period that we have now and for other reasons. But right now we're at the very first time that the Corps of Engineers has selected, and it's very important to emphasize this word, tentatively selected, the plan that we think might best work as a framework to build from to address coastal storm risk in the study area. That being said, there are 5 with project alternatives, which I'll describe here in a minute, and we need to see what feedback we get on those other alternatives or the tentatively selected plan. The first step that we have following the comment review period is basically to see whether we need to go with another plan, we need to revise this plan somehow, hybridize it, but then to deep dive on this plan because we're still relatively early in the study process. We still have at least a third of the study to get through to kind of get to a point where we can make those recommendations to Congress. And then that recommendation, which will only be based on what the non-federal sponsor support and with the feedback that we get from the public, it'll be in their hands to decide what happens from there. So the report that we released in late September, our draft report, as the Colonel mentioned, that report along with all the appendices are about 4,000 pages. It's all on our website, as the Colonel showed, and the portal page is also on that website. So the alternatives that we have, there are pros and cons that we've heard from the public, and there are pros and cons, admittedly, with all these alternatives. They basically span a very large spectrum from very large in-water structures at one end of the spectrum, alternative 2, for example, to alternative 5, which is only land-based measures. And in between, there's stepping into the estuary, smaller surge gates, increasingly as you get to the higher number of alternatives, combined with shoreline-based measures. So there are various features on them. The alternative that we tentatively selected, as the Colonel mentioned, is alternative 3B, basically this middle alternative, which we believe best balances the areas that still have coastal storm risk, that dovetails nicely with a lot of the other projects that have been or are being done within the study area, and also gives us the greatest bang for the buck in terms of net benefits. The plan that we come up with, right now, we can best describe as a framework. We don't have all the pieces, of the puzzle together. We just have the big pieces in place in the different plans. And so with that, we need to get feedback, and we need to, in the advancement of this study, hone in and fill in a lot more of those pieces. So I want to emphasize that it is a framework. We won't have answers to every question because a lot of the details are either later in the study or even in the design phase, as the Colonel mentioned. But to the extent that we can answer questions, we'd be more than happy to in the question and answer comment period. So to that extent, if you see something you have a question on, please fill it out on the card. We'll be collecting them at the end of this presentation and going through those questions. In terms of what plan does get advanced, one thing that is, regardless of which alternative we go forward with, there have been a few key features that we've noted will be likely in the plan that gets advanced and ultimately recommended to Congress. That is to say, we see a layered approach, and by that we mean not just one solution for different areas, but many different solutions tailored to each area. Of course, the very first step in any coastal storm risk management plan is having the public well informed about what those risks are, making sure they're well informed as to how to get out of areas of high risk during a coastal storm as one is bearing down. So evacuation route planning and those type of education systems is layer one. Everything we do on top of that is what can we do to best address those damages and impacts that occur from those storms. In terms of implementing the plan, we see it as a phased implementation. The first phase being trying to implement things that are less controversial, less complex, more easily implemented immediately following the design period as part of the construction. But admittedly, a lot of the features that are in a lot of the plan that we tentatively selected are a lot more complex and will need a lot more further evaluation and design work. So those might take more design work and more construction work. So those are more of a mid-term phased implementation. And then ultimately, we need to make sure that whatever we put in place, given there's a great amount of uncertainty going into the future with sea level rise and climate change, that we can adapt whatever we put in place so that if climate change and sea level rise breaks worse than what we projected or designed for, that we can add additional feet onto the elevation of these structures and adapt them so that they can work for those change conditions in the future without having to take them all out. So a layered plan, a phased plan, and an adaptable plan are key components of what we see going forward, regardless of what that plan is. Oops. So in terms of the conditions in the port, it's very important for us to capture what the current conditions are in terms of what projects have been put in place to address coastal storm risk, what type of existing features are in the port and the harbor area. A lot of these existing conditions that you see here on the left side of this graphic, are not a surprise to anyone, and probably any one of these would make it a very notable study, and together they certainly warrant being classified as a mega study. The graphic that's on the right is a very important one because this is, for purposes of our common evaluation between the different alternatives, the flood event that we've been using to try to design features to address coastal storm risk as part of each of the different plans. So it's right now described as the 1% flood event, otherwise commonly known as the 100-year flood event. And we've also added to that the intermediate sea level rise projection, which I'll describe here in a minute. But that storm event is, or that risk profile, if you will, is what we've been using to try to evaluate the different plans. But that's not set right now in our project, or in terms of our recommendations. Following the public outreach that we have now, after we get to our agency decision milestone, we'll be optimizing to see if a different storm event might generate greater net benefit. So a lot of the design features that you see that we show in the renderings later on in the presentation, those are all based on this 1% flood event, but that's subject to change. So the elevation and layout might change also. So it's very important to bear in mind that what we have now is very conceptual and preliminary, as the commander mentioned. And so the location where these features might go might change. The type of feature that's in those locations might change. Right now, these are very conceptual, so we're looking for feedback on that, but nothing is set in stone. So in terms of some of the larger scale projects that have been put in place or are being constructed now, this graphic basically takes that into account. And that's really important from the standpoint of we don't want to necessarily double count benefits. That is to say, damages that could be avoided from what we might put in place as part of an outcome of this study, if it is advanced by Congress and gets funded, versus what's already been put in place in the area. So this project basically captures a lot of the larger shoreline-based projects that have been put in place by the Corps, as well as other agencies around New York City, the South Shore of Staten Island, Coney Island, Rockaway is in construction right now. But basically, these projects are in place, so you'll see that some of the plans that we have a lot of redundancy. That is to say, they would also address risk for those same areas, so there is redundancy with them. But other projects, particularly our tentatively selected plan and some of the others, dovetail very nicely with these projects that have already been put in place. Sea level rise is arguably the largest uncertainty facing this coastal storm risk management study of any variable. And affects the plant formulation dramatically in terms of the damages that can occur going into the longer-term distant future. This slide shows a lot of information. I'll try to break it down. Basically, the gray boxes here in the middle are kind of showing what our study process is laid out over time. We have our study phase that we're in about halfway, 2/3 through right now. We have a couple more years of that, and at the end of that, after we make our recommendation to Congress, Congress might give us authorization and we might be able to proceed into design. We've assumed 6 years for that. And then right now we have an assumption of 14 years for construction. Some alternatives have more, some have less. That works to the advantage of those that have less. It works to the disadvantage of those alternatives that have a longer period of construction than this, because we define a base year that sets an economic period of analysis. Now, the economic period of analysis is 50 years, but we do have a planning horizon, and we assume that whatever is put in place will be operated, maintained, and adapted as needed into the future through the long-term future, effectively permanently for this region. So what's shown at the bottom of this figure are basically the various projections for sea level rise that the Corps of Engineers has, and it's for this location, the battery in lower Manhattan. And it does change depending on where you are in the study area. But it also shows what the two states have for their projections, as well as New York City with these colored dots. And they've actually assigned probability with their colors. So you can see the Corps' projection, high projection, is this white line. The intermediate projection is the gray line, and the black line is the low projection. We've been using the intermediate projection because if you look at the actual measured sea level at the battery, it's recorded every hour, every day. It's actually shown here in this little magenta line, which is kind of hard to see. And depending on how you take that wealth of data in terms of the measured sea level at the battery and develop a trend line, we've been tracking for the last 30 years most closely between intermediate and high, depending on how you develop those trend lines. So that's why we've used the intermediate, at least for our current evaluation process. But this is a huge uncertainty in the study, and it's for this reason that we need to have adaptation be a key element of whatever's put in place. It also does affect dramatically the type of damages that can occur in this region, because as every foot goes up in sea level rise, it means the inundation and the damages goes further and further inland. So the damages that we have go up several fold, depending on whether you're looking at the intermediate projection or the high projection going out into those out years. So at the past meetings that we've had, particularly on the interim report back in 2019, we heard a lot of concerns related to storm surge barriers. And the storm surge barriers are in 4 of the 5 alternatives that we have. So one of the issues that we heard was when the gates are not closed on storm surge barriers, what happens with it? So let me just explain this graphic to begin with. This is a storm surge barrier rendering for a storm surge gate on the inlet into Jamaica Bay. It happens to be in our tentatively selected plan, but it's also in alternatives 3A as well as in alternative 4. So it has shoreline-based tie-ins to tie into high ground along Rockaway Peninsula as well as going across into southern Brooklyn. Then it has auxiliary gates that allow for tidal flow, navigational gates, but the gate structure, as you can see, would not necessarily be operated for every storm event. So the issue is when the gates aren't operated, what happens to those low-lying areas that lie along Jamaica Bay? So for that concern, what we've evaluated since we resumed the studies over this last year is really to do a better deep dive on what we refer to as risk reduction features. So these are features that are added behind the storm surge barriers, and they have 2 benefits. One is not just when the gates are left open for a frequent storm, where the gates might, to close them on that frequent storm basis, might have unacceptable impacts on navigation or the environment. What happens to those areas low lines behind the gates? So we've designed and have included in all the plans, as applicable, risk reduction features behind the storm surge barriers to address those frequent risks. They also have the added benefit that, given it like in Jamaica Bay, during a storm event, even when these gates are closed at the inlet, enough water can slosh around within Jamaica Bay to cause flooding on those low-lying areas from that dynamic as well. So risk reduction features kind of serve for those dual purposes. And then another concern that we heard heavily at the meetings that we had on the interim report was what happens with storm surge barriers in terms of where you divert water from by closing these gates off to these various bay areas during the storm event. And so we've modeled that and have identified these areas and come up with, for areas outside of storm surge gates in each of the plans, where the model shows that there might be some worsened flooding from those features, we've added into the plan induced flooding mitigation features. Now, as it turns out, in the modeling that we did for this area, it looked like Breezy Point community has induced flooding impacts, so we have an added feature for dealing with that in that community, but there's also others. As it turns out, alternative 3B, which we've tentatively selected, of the 4 alternatives that have storm surge gates, it has the least amount of induced flooding mitigation and induced flooding mitigation impacts. So that feedback that helped us dive into this consideration and concern actually really helped to formulate and get us to the tentatively selected plan that we have today. So we are terribly grateful to the public for the feedback that we've had so far in this study and look to get additional as we go forward further. So just to go through the 5 alternatives that we have in a little bit more detail. Alternative 2 is basically the largest scale project that we have. As you can see, it has the very longest storm surge gate of all the alternatives from Sandy Hook to Breezy Point along the Pine High Ground on Sandy Hook and the Rockaway Peninsula. It also has a storm surge gate on the Throgs Neck. But it does have a couple points about it. First, it has by far the biggest study area coverage in terms of geographical, and that's kind of represented by the green shaded area that you see on the slide. But it also has a few other considerations which weigh heavily against it. One is it has a lot of induced flooding impacts that you can see in northern Nassau County with the shoreline-based measures that you see there. It also has by far the largest cost of all the alternatives, and it also has the longest construction duration, and that's primarily from the 6 miles of storm surge gate. And additionally, it also has a lot of redundancy with a lot of the projects that have been put in place within the estuary. So it's for this reason we think this alternative actually is not economically feasible. Again, the cost and the construction duration count heavily against it. So this is one alternative. It's a largest scale alternative, but it does address the biggest area. So every alternative has pros and cons, and we're trying to find that sweet spot where we can get the best bang for the buck and kind of best address the coastal storm risk that still faces this region. So alternative 3A steps further back in the estuary. It has a storm surge barrier on the Arctic Hill, the Verrazano Narrows, and the Throgs Neck area, the same as you saw in alternative 2 there. It also has a large shoreline-based measure and storm surge gate along the southern Brooklyn and Queens area encompassing Jamaica Bay, addressing that area of high risk. It also has, you can see in Lower Bay, an additional amount of large amount of induced flooding mitigation features. And that, we think, is because of the Verrazano Narrows gate, because in alternative 3B, it has the same gate structure here on the Arctic Hill and the Jamaica Bay area, but it does not have the Verrazano Narrows, and it does not have that same induced flooding impact based on our modeling in the Lower Bay area. Again, that's one of the reasons why 3B kind of stands out from the rest in our evaluation. You can see, though, that it does have a fairly substantial benefit to the area that it does cover. It does have the second highest cost and the second longest duration. Again, that counts heavily against it also in our economic evaluation. It also has some redundancy with some of the projects, particularly those that have been built in the Upper Bay and in the inner areas of the harbor. Alternative 3B steps further back into the estuary. It basically has the same gate structure and shoreline-based measure for South Brooklyn and Queens as you saw in alternative 3A. But then it has an Arctic Hill storm surge barrier as well as a storm surge barrier on the mouth of the kill vent called Tidal Straits, which basically address coastal storm risk to the backside of Staten Island as well as a lot of the inner coastal areas of New Jersey. But from there, it has 3 shoreline-based measures, primary features along in Jersey City, downtown Manhattan where we are now, as well as in East Harlem, areas highly impacted from Hurricane Sandy. And then it also has 3 additional features for some smaller creeks that are in Brooklyn and in Queens. Gowanus Creek Canal, Newtown Creek between Brooklyn and Queens, and then Flushing Creek. So those are the 8 primary features. The Arthur Hill, Caroline Colt Gate, the Jamaica Bay Gate, and those 2 actually are half of the study cost, if not a little bit more. And then the shoreline-based measures you see in Jersey City, Manhattan, and I'll go into greater detail on these in a few slides. And then the 3 storm surge gates there in Brooklyn and Queens. It has a $52.7 billion first cost and a total cost, present value basis, which takes into account operation and maintenance costs of $76 billion. And it also coincides with that 14-year construction period that I showed earlier that defined our base year of 2044. Construction on all the alternatives are assumed to start in 2030. Alternative 4 steps further back in the estuary, particularly in the New Jersey and the Staten Island area, by having a gate on the Hackensack River instead of a gate on the Hill and Cole and Arthur Hill. But otherwise, in terms of the Upper Bay and in New York City, outside of Staten Island, it's basically the same as what you saw in Alternative 3A. So you have a storm surge barrier in South Brooklyn and Queens, encompassing Jamaica Bay, smaller storm surge gates on Newtown, Flushing, and Gowanus Creek, and shoreline-based measures for Jersey City, downtown Manhattan, and East Harlem. You can also see in this alternative there's a fair amount of induced flooding impacts in the Newark Bay and northern Staten Island area from the Hackensack River gate. So this alternative also has a fair amount of mileage of induced flooding mitigation features. Again, that kind of counts against it in economic analysis. Alternative 5, which is defined as having no in-water structures, is very limited in terms of the areas where we've been able to identify and justify shoreline-based only type measures. There are areas in the Hackensack Netherlands where we think that might be possible, and then those 3 features that are in Alternative 3A and Alternative 4 in Jersey City, downtown Manhattan, and East Harlem. But because it doesn't have any in-water features, it has no induced flooding mitigation features, and it has no risk reduction features. It also has the lowest price and the lowest time period for construction, which count towards it, but since it does have a very limited amount of application, it only addresses about 3% of the study area that would be flooded from that 1% design event. I'd like to also mention now, before I turn it over to Cheryl Ackelmeyer, our NEPA specialist that's been working on the Tier 1 EIS, that if you have any comments on these alternatives as we go through this presentation, please do fill out your comment card, and we'll be collecting those at the end of the presentation. And we'll be happy to answer those questions at that time. Cheryl?
Okay, thank you, Bryce. And good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Ackelmeyer. I'm the National Environmental Policy Act lead on the study. The National Environmental Policy Act requires federal agencies, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to consider the potential environmental impacts of their proposed actions and any reasonable alternatives before undertaking a federal action or constructing a project. There are many environmental laws, regulations, and executive orders that we must demonstrate compliance with under the National Environmental Policy Act, including but not limited to those listed on this slide. The Council on Environmental Quality provides for 3 types of NEPA analysis based on the significance for impacts. Based on the complexity and scale of this study, the study team is preparing a tiered environmental impact statement, which is the most in-depth type of review occurring in 2 tiers. So the Tier 1 environmental impact statement is being completed right now in this feasibility phase of the project, and the Tier 2 environmental impact statements will be completed in the pre-construction engineering and design phase of the project. The Tier 1 consists of a broad level review, big picture, conceptual, preliminary design. And the Tier 2 will consist of additional site-specific, more detailed reviews as the design is further refined. An important note here is that no plan can be constructed until the full Tier 1 and Tier 2 environmental impact statements have been completed and all permits have been obtained. The study team identified a large list comprised of approximately 50 environmental resources and considerations within the study area that required further evaluation at this Tier 1 level to determine the potential impacts of the alternatives and the tentatively selected plan. In this integrated feasibility report and Tier 1 environmental impact statement, and under the U.S. Army Corps' risk-informed planning process, the analysis relies heavily on existing and readily available information, including recent reports prepared by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and others such as the Federal Highway Administration. A bit about report organization. As you navigate through the report, Chapter 2 includes the existing conditions of each environmental resource as a baseline to compare the impacts of the alternatives, including the no-action alternative. Those are organized by planning region or a combination of planning regions where similar conditions exist. The evaluation of environmental consequences is located in Chapter 6, and it starts with a screening for the potential presence or absence of adverse impacts based on measure type, shown in the center here, followed by an assessment of the magnitude of those impacts utilizing a rating score methodology of 1 through 5, with 1 being no impacts and 5 being high or significant impacts that would be environmentally unacceptable. Each alternative and environmental resource was assessed and rated on a scale of 1 to 5 on individual resource scorecards for construction, operations and maintenance, and mitigated impact outcomes. A few key notes here for the Tier 1 assessment: direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts have been assessed very broadly. Beneficial environmental effects were estimated and where identified are indicated on those scorecards with a plus symbol. And that was done to not mute the adverse impact score. Cooperating agency, participating agency, and stakeholder input was considered and incorporated in the preparation of this report. And mitigated impacts were estimated at a broad Tier 1 level, all to be further refined in subsequent phases of the study, including the final Tier 1 and Tier 2 environmental impact statements. All alternatives, including the no-action alternative, have potential adverse impacts of varying magnitudes. And all alternatives have associated potential beneficial effects depending on the environmental resource and structural measure type. Highlighted here are a few examples of the potential adverse impacts of the alternatives, as well as potential benefits of the alternatives, including the no-action alternative adverse impacts include the potential coastal storm risk would continue to impact wildlife and threaten endangered species habitat, changes in water quality such as salinity and dissolved oxygen and flow patterns, the spread of invasive and aquatic nuisance species from flooding. Low-lying areas would continue to experience coastal flood damages to special status land, and many others. Potential adverse impacts of the study alternatives include in-water measures may impact fish species, migratory patterns, and habitat, and those were observed to be range from low to moderate high. Hazardous, toxic, and radioactive waste sites are prevalent in this heavily urban environment and may delay construction. National Park Service property impacts from measures that are co-located on National Park Service land, which would require further coordination with the National Park Service and the Department of Interior, and mutual acceptability between the Department of Army and the Department of Interior, and viewshed changes. Potential beneficial effects of the study alternatives include reef effect of in-water measures attracting numerous species of shellfish, algae, and other invertebrates, reduced risk of coastal flooding to special status species habitat and areas, including threatened endangered species, Coastal Barrier Resource Act areas, among many others. So for additional details about the impacts and benefits of the different alternatives and the no-action alternative, those can be found in Chapter 6 of the draft report located on our study website. So after each individual resource for the alternative measures were rated on scores of 1 through 5, the individual resources were combined into resource categories and averaged together to assess each alternative's overall magnitude for impact for construction, shown on the left, operations and maintenance, shown in the middle, and mitigated impact outcomes, shown on the right. This exercise was utilized to compare the overall alternative ratings for environmental acceptability on a consistent scale. While the average scores of the resource categories exhibit no to low impact based on that rating criteria I showed a couple slides ago, the impacts to the individual resources are anticipated to range from no to moderate high, depending on the resource and alternative, and this discussion is presented in Chapter 6. A few key takeaways here are that all alternatives incur impacts of varying magnitudes, and as you can see here, the tentatively selected plan falls right in the middle. The impacts are generally observed to be highest during construction, but are temporary, and all alternatives have potential beneficial effects as well. A notable comment that we received during the scoping and interim report review periods was a request for a more comprehensive environmental justice analysis. So in coordination with our Engineering Research and Development Center, the State of New York, the State of New Jersey, and the City of New York's Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, we prepared a preliminary analysis on other social effects and environmental justice. In the other social effects analysis, factors affecting vulnerability were considered, including but not limited to low income and poverty level, the elderly and very young, disabled persons, female head of households, among many others. The framework utilized to assess the effects of the alternatives included physical and mental health and safety, economic vitality, social connectedness and identity, social vulnerability, participation, and recreation and leisure. From the other social effects analysis, the vulnerability of factors relative to environmental justice were overlaid with the environmental burdens provided in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Justice Screening Tool. The results of the assessment found that for the tentatively selected plan, 63% of the census tracts within the study area meet the criteria for a disadvantaged community, and almost every segment of the tentatively selected plan intersects with a disadvantaged community. While some low impacts are expected to these communities from the construction and operations and maintenance, we anticipate those impacts can be mitigated for, and that overall the tentatively selected plan would largely have beneficial effects as the more vulnerable portion of the population would experience reduced risk for flood damage and flood-related point source contamination. At the scale of this analysis, it's important to recognize that certain impacts to vulnerable communities can be hard to parse out. Therefore, we're looking to refine this analysis as the project advances, which will be guided by meaningful feedback from stakeholders in the study area, including all of you. Removing barriers to participation in this project is a priority for us and our partners. And from the beginning of the study, the district has engaged in a more robust public outreach strategy. We hosted 9 public meetings during the scoping period and 8 public meetings during the interim report period that were located throughout the study area and locations that were more easily accessible by public transportation. And with the release of the draft report, we continue to work to reach as broad a cross-section of the public as possible. We've also been collaborating with interest groups, academic institutions, and community boards to help us disseminate information and provide opportunities for communities to ask questions and raise concerns. We developed a story map to help communicate the ideas found in the draft report visually, prepared flyers and pamphlets in multiple languages, added more accessibility features to our website, meetings and presentations, all of this with the aim of reaching the public and the underserved members of the public and identify localized concerns and issues to help inform planning and design going forward. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineering Research and Development Center also developed the New York Bight ecological model to aid in assessing impacts of the alternatives being considered in this draft report. A conceptual visual of this model is shown on this slide and includes the assessment of 6 ecosystem types present within the New York Bight, ranging from marine to freshwater ecosystems. The results of the New York Bight ecological model are presented in the draft report for agency and stakeholder review, and following additional input will be incorporated in the impact assessment for the final Tier 1 environmental impact statement. So before I turn it over to our next speaker, I'd just like to remind you to please fill out your comment cards if you have any questions. Please print slowly and clearly so that we can read your question in the Q&A section. Thank you very much.
So we're ready to collect the comment cards now, if you have them ready, and have Carly.
Yeah, if you have them ready, please wave them a little bit and we'll collect them. Thank you.
And if you'd like to get more, we'd be more than happy to give them to you. Okay. Thank you, Cheryl. Just to continue on, the slide that we're showing now is basically a summation of the benefit and cost analysis that we did. Right now, our benefits have been based primarily on damages to existing structures, of which there's over 275,000 that are within what could be flooded from a coastal storm in the study area. And we have done other analyses in the past that have been GIS-based that look at a broader range of types of impacts in terms of population density and other social effects. And those have seemed to track fairly well, because when it comes to critical infrastructure, population, the structures themselves, the study area is so densely covered with all of those things that we've found a lot of correlation between these analyses. So because we had a database that was set up well for evaluating the damages to the various structures, we've used that primarily for our evaluation purposes so far. But we do acknowledge that as we move forward with the study, we do want to look at other critical infrastructure, other possible effects, and then of course life safety type considerations between these alternatives. But as it stands right now, based on those costs that I had shown previously, on an average annual basis, that is to say over that 50-year period if it was amortized out over the 50 years, basically break down to these costs that you see here in the left column. The costs in the middle column are the average annual benefits. Again, these are right now using a probabilistic, very detailed model in terms of all those 275,000 structures and what those risk profile is over time with the intermediate sea level rise added onto it. You can see that the alternative 2, which has the biggest geographic coverage in terms of protection, isn't the largest, and that's because it takes such a long time to construct. It gets discounted against that alternative for that reason. Alternative 3A, 3B, and 4, you can see, which have always been the best performing alternatives, have the greatest net benefits on an average annual basis, or I should say greatest benefits on an average annual basis. But then when you subtract the cost from the benefits to get to the net benefits, you can see that alternative 3B has the greatest net benefits. And so that's one of the primary drivers that we have, is to try to get the alternative that has the biggest bang for the buck. That being said, there are a lot of features that we have to fill in. As I mentioned earlier, it is a framework, so we have a lot more details to work out on this plan as it goes forward. But right now, it has a fairly robust net benefits and a benefit to cost ratio of about 2.5. And while that's really good in terms of having an economically justified project, it also speaks to the damage profile that still exists in this area, taking into account all those other projects that have been done. All of those damages that are avoided by putting one of these alternatives, for example, alternative 3B into place, those are damages that would occur without it. So by far the worst alternative of all of them, well, it's not shown here, is alternative 1, doing nothing. And that's really the bottom line, is that we have what we think might be a good framework, a good plan to work from going forward. But if you think differently, you think another plan is better, please tell us in your comments and tell us why, so we know what to evaluate further as we go forward. But as it is, alternative 3B gives us, right now based on our analysis that we have, the greatest net benefits of the alternatives. So just to do a little bit deeper dive into what alternative 3B encompasses, I mentioned earlier it has 8 primary features, one of which is a large feature that encompasses the backside of Staten Island, as well as the inner areas of New Jersey, the coastally flooded areas, by having a storm surge gate on the Arctic Hill and the Kill then Cold Tidal Straits. Then we also have included within this feature risk reduction that I'll show in greater detail in the coming slides. Now, of course, being that this is the largest port on the Atlantic seaboard, if not the nation, the largest refined petroleum port, having storm surge gates on these main channels into the port is a major consideration. We have done some coordination and outreach with maritime interests the San Diego pilots, the docking pilots, the Coast Guard, and we look to be doing more on that to ensure that navigation can be safely maintained, of course, in this port with these type gate or storm surge barriers type structures. But that is a major consideration related to this feature. So these are a couple renderings of what those storm surge gates might look like on the Kilgan Cole now. So this is Bayonne and this is Staten Island, and that's Newark Bay in the distance. And the Arctic Hill Channel. You can see Manhattan skyline in the distance. This is looking more or less north-northeasterly with the outer ridge crossing up here. So storm surge gates in these areas have the benefit of being able to tie into high ground fairly close to where those gates are located. But being on the navigation channels, they of course have fairly large dimensions in terms of the opening gates structure. So for the KVK gate, we assume an 800-foot wide opening with a floating sector gate. Gates that have been done in other ports like Rotterdam, St. Petersburg in Russia have used these type of floating sector gates, actually larger ones than what we have outlined with these two locations. But then they have about a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile of shoreline-based measures to tie into high ground at both of these. So these are just renderings to kind of show conceptually what these structures might look like at these two locations. In terms of the risk reduction features that we have behind these, there's a number of them in the Sag and Hackensack River. There's actually a secondary storm surge barrier labeled here as the Netherlands Gate on the Hackensack River. Now, these risk reduction features are designed to address the frequent flooding that can occur because those large barriers on the Kilgan Cole and Arctic Hill, being that they are on the main shipping channels, likely would not close for any storm event. And given that they're floating sector gates, they have quite a long duration time to enact the closure operation. So for that reason, these risk reduction features are designed for addressing this flood risk when those gates would not be closed. And those areas that would be flooded from what we've currently assumed for the operational condition, which is the same for all the storm surge gates and all the alternatives right now, which is defined at a +7 elevation here at the battery as it translates out to these other locations. Basically, these risk reduction features address that 7-foot flooding event condition as that would affect these areas, which is basically the red shaded areas. The large gates on the Arctic Hill and the Kilgan Cole, whereas those would address the green shaded areas where the flood damage would be more spread out because those hold back the more moderate and severe storms. These risk reduction features, which are flood walls, a gate on the Hackensack River, different type of measures throughout the Arctic Hill as well as in the Netherlands and Safe River area, would address the more frequent flooding. So in the story map, you can actually zoom in on these features in a lot greater detail. And currently we have assigned different types of features for all of these locations, but those are all quite conceptual, quite very preliminary, and we would look to, based on the feedback we get from the public, improve upon them, enhance them, and revise them to make them more acceptable in terms of their features. In this area, on this feature, we also have non-structural measures for areas where we don't think a structural measure could work. So there's 158 structures, 19 in New York City and 139 in New Jersey, that we think we might need to either do some type of a ring wall, smaller structural measure, or some type of a non-structural application on those buildings. The other large feature of the 8 that we have is the Jamaica Bay Storm Surge Barrier and Shoreline-Based Measure, which basically ties into high ground around the Narrows, runs down along Coney Island, crosses Sheepshead Bay with one storm surge barrier, crosses Garrison Creek with another storm surge barrier, and then the Jamaica Bay Inlet with the storm surge barrier that I had shown earlier. So this also then ties into high ground, basically building off of the project that's being built now along the Rockaway Peninsula. It also has 4 areas behind the storm surge barriers in Jamaica Bay for risk reduction features. It also has an induced flooding impact feature around Breezy Point community because, again, based on our modeling, it appears that there is an induced flooding impact in that area. We think primarily because of the storm surge gate on the Jamaica Bay and holding back all the water that otherwise could have gone into Jamaica Bay. So on the left-hand side, we're happy to have Our initial proposal renderings of the different type of approaches that can be done along for some of these shoreline-based measures. So what you see here is an elevated promenade, and it's very conceptual, very preliminary, but at least it's thought-provoking. That's the primary purpose that we have in developing these renderings, is to help the public kind of understand what we're trying to address and do with these different shoreline-based measures. So this is an elevated promenade that would be along the boardwalk area, basically in this area, the orange line. And again, on the story map website, you can actually go in and look in great details what all these various features are. The purple being sea walls, the yellow flood walls, but there's a whole number of different features that we've assumed based on existing information that we have, which is not absolutely certain in all locations. So it's a very preliminary, very conceptual. But this is a very large feature that we have. It's, I want to say, 116,000 feet of shoreline-based measures in this feature. It has those 3 storm surge gates that I mentioned on the inlet, as well as Sheepshead Bay and Garrison Creek. We have initial design. Again, these designs are all based on the currently selected design storm event, that 1% storm event that we've used. So that might change as we optimize on these features going forward into the future. But this lays out the type of gate structure, it lays out the length of water that it would be, and then it also shows, you know, the number of auxiliary gates that we've also assumed at different locations to try to maintain as much as possible the tide range, tide prism, and have least effect on the hydrodynamics that exist within the estuary, a highly valued resource in the region. Another feature that we have, which is very close to where we are today, is a shoreline-based measure that follows along from where the city's project, the 2 bridges, ends here at the Brooklyn Bridge. It goes around the battery and then up the west side of Lower Manhattan. Now, in this area, there's also a couple other plans that have been developed, and one is even put in place by the Battery Park City Authority. So we do need to, and we recognize, we need to consolidate our plan with theirs as this feature moves forward to reconcile, you know, make sure our plan dovetails nicely with what those other activities are in terms of those planning efforts. Because one constraint that we have on the study is we don't want to impede or interfere with any other coastal storm risk management or resiliency effort. It's a safety net type study, so we're looking to enhance and improve and address areas that currently just don't have coastal storm risk projects already being planned or being put in place. You can also note on this map, just because it's shown well there is an induced flooding mitigation feature there along Kips Bay and the East River. This alternative 3B, the tentatively selected plan, does have a little bit of induced flooding, particularly in East River and the Harlem River areas, which you'll see on some of the graphics. And we think it's primarily not from these shoreline-based measures because they don't hold that back that much water, but more of those larger barrier structures, either in Jamaica Bay or the Kill Dimple and Arthur Kill. But that's something we need to evaluate further as the study advances. You can see on the right side, this is, again, a very initial rendering of what the flood wall along the, around Christopher Street in our plan might look like. So there are access points that would be closed during a storm event, which you can see on the graphic on the lower right. And this is just an initial rendering. There's other type measures that can be done. Flood walls with park features, elevated promenades, flip-up barriers. And we've used a lot of those in this plan, but this is just an initial outline of what we think might be workable in this area. But we look for feedback on that and look to improve and enhance the plan going forward. Another major shoreline-based feature that we have as part of the 8 is the East Harlem area. And this graphic shows the area along East Harlem. It also shows an induced flooding mitigation impact feature that we have in the lower Bronx. Again, I mentioned that the East River and the Harlem River are the areas where we see induced flooding impacts from this plan. But it is the least amount of induced flooding of all the plants that have storm surge barriers. So this involves about 5 miles of shoreline-based measures, going basically from the Hellgate area up to near the Spike and Daigle area on the Harlem River. It involves vehicle gates, flood walls, elevated promenades, of which you can see there's a couple in these renderings. Here at 145th Street along the Harlem River, and here along 106th Street along the East River. Basically, existing conditions and then the elevated promenade that we conceptualized for these areas. You can also see what the conditions would be like during a storm event as it started to impact the area. So again, these renderings are primarily provided just to try to get people a better concept of what might be done in these locations, but that's not set in stone. If there's some other approach that can be done to address coastal storm risk in these areas, we would love to hear that feedback, and we are all open to change in both the location and layout, as well as the type of measure that's in these areas. Another shoreline-based measure that we have is in Jersey City. It dovetails with the project that New Jersey DEP is advancing in the Hoboken area. It's a rebuild by design project. So it basically ties on with that project, runs along the Jersey City waterfront and along the Liberty State Park area. It has levees in Liberty State Park area. You can see that in the rendering on the left there along this road as it's added, and then during a storm event. It also has elevated promenades along in York Street in Jersey City there. You can see how that's been conceptualized in this alternative. This is a fairly long shoreline-based measure at 43,000 feet, and it also has, in addition to just pedestrian gates, it also has railroad gates as well as vehicle gates. So, of the three smaller storm surge gates that are in Brooklyn and Queens, this is the one that's in Newtown Creek, between Brooklyn and Queens. It basically is a storm surge barrier on a sector gate at the mouth of Newtown Creek. Newtown Creek, as many might know, is a fairly heavily polluted creek due to decades and decades of industrial work done around that area. So for that reason, we recognize that there would need to deal with its contamination issues prior to the advancement of this feature, at least in the footprint for where these features would be placed. And then there's also a very large wastewater treatment plant that New York City DEP operates. So we also recognize that just to avoid flooding behind the barriers and the shoreline-based measures, during the storm when those barriers were closed, the discharge point for that wastewater treatment plant might need to be relocated out. It should be pointed out that based on comments we've also received in the past in the interim report, we've also looked at and have costs for dealing with interior drainage with all the various features and all the different alternatives. So that was one notable one with this shoreline-based measure in terms of the relocation of it, but we have also estimated interior drainage costs with all the features. Now you can see the rendering on the right is showing a seawall in the park area there at Huron Street in Greenpoint in Brooklyn. Now again, these layouts are conceptual. It might be possible to relocate that seawall behind the park. There's not a lot of damage to be avoided in protecting the park, so that kind of demonstrates the flexibility that we have in our plan. Not just the type of measure that might be in these locations, but the locations themselves. So another smaller storm surge gate structure, which is also on a creek, which also has, unfortunately, a lot of contamination issues, is the Gowanus Creek Canal, as well as the Red Hook neighborhood. We have a sector gate assumed for the Gowanus Creek Canal, as well as 18,000 feet, or roughly about 3 miles of shoreline-based measures running along in the Red Hook community. You can see a rendering that shows what the flood wall might look like there at Coffey Street. It's basically right here. So that little red dot is basically that access point that you're seeing here. But that's another shoreline-based measure combined with the storm surge gates there in Brooklyn. There we go. So the last of the 8 primary features that we have in the plan is Flushing Bay area, Flushing Bay and Creek. It basically has a vertical liftgate structure assumed at the mouth of Flushing Creek, as well as some shoreline-based measures tying in the high ground, addressing coastal storm risk for the area shaded here in green. And you can see the flood wall with levee type components to it. That's in the initial rendering that we've come up with for this area, just to kind of give a feel for what these features might look like in these areas. So I'd like to, before I turn it over to Danielle, once again remind folks, if you have comments or questions on any of these features, any of these alternatives, please fill them out on the comment cards. We'd love to collect those and answer those when we get to our comment and answer, or question and answer section. Danielle Tomaso, our lead planner on the study, will now talk about the schedule and the steps going forward.
Did everyone get that? Oh, there will be a quiz. So like Bryce said, my name is Danielle Tomaso. I'm a planner in the New York District Planning Division. What I want to do, because this meeting is your meeting, and we do want to get to the Q&A session, I'm just going to put a bow on the presentation. And I want to note, I see people taking pictures, certainly please do so, but I want to note that this presentation is being recorded, and we're also going to post the slide deck on the web after today, so look forward to that. So just to summarize what Bryce and Cheryl walked us through, because this will be important to remember during our Q&A session, the tentatively selected plan is alternative 3B, and what like Colonel Lozado kicked us off with and highlighted in the beginning, the plan is both preliminary and conceptual. Considerable work remains to be done, and all of that work is going to be informed by your feedback and new information that we learn throughout the study process and the design process. I also want to highlight there are a lot of resources on the study website, including the draft report that Cheryl walked us through. There's the reader's guide, and of course the story map hub. We have a live story map out in the front. Doug Madera, our project geographer, can walk you through it after the presentation when we get back outside. The last thing I want to say is that this is one of a series of public meetings. Just show of hands, who's attended one of our virtual meetings or a meeting about the study? Yeah, that's great to see. So thank you for attending those meetings. I think meetings like that, meetings like this today are really good ways to engage the study team, engage with you, and you engage with the study team. So we'll be posting information about future virtual and in-person meetings on our study website. So just quickly, schedule, just thinking big picture, where we've been, where we're going. Bryce mentioned that the study kicked off in 2016, and a lot of work has been done between now and then. I mentioned that we'll be hosting more public meetings. They'll be held after the holidays in January and February, and throughout the public comment period that again ends on March 7th, 2023. So please, I encourage you to write a comment card today. Those will be part of the record. Email us, send us snail mail, however you want to get in touch with us. If you're part of an organization, please after the meeting get with us. We'd be happy to meet with your organization as we have been throughout the public comment period. And again, I want to point to the online resources. Show of hands again, who learned about this meeting through the website? Okay. What about an email? What about an email from the Army Corps? What about an email from another group? Okay, great. What about word of mouth? Yeah. Any other way you heard about this meeting?
Community board.
Community board, great, thank you. That's great to know. Thank you. That's great to know the word's getting out about these meetings. And if you're part of a group or you know of a group that we could work with to get the word out, certainly please tell us after the meeting. Anybody with a tag like this, we'd love to hear from you about your ideas. I know Colonel Lozado said this at the top, but I just want to end with this before the Q&A session. Your feedback is important, and we're really grateful that you took time today to be at this meeting. We want to hear your feedback. What we're going to do is through the Q&A session, we're going to use your comment cards first. We're going to go through the comments through the cards, and if we have time, we'll go around with the microphone. If you think of something later today or throughout the comment period, please send us written comments. We don't want to paraphrase what you share with us today. We want to hear it from you. So please write it down. Please email us. Put it down on a comment card. Send us a comment in the mail. Anything you'd like to do to tell us what you think about what we presented today. So with that, I want to invite Arun here, our engineering lead, up to the stage if you don't mind. And I want to also ask Karen Beaumont from our planning division, Jesse Miller from our planning division, others who have comment cards. Yeah, come on. So again, what we'll do is we'll go through the comment cards first. We have our subject matter experts here at the table. We have others throughout the room, so hopefully we answer your questions. They're grouped by theme. Okay, so what everybody's been doing hard at work is grouping your questions by theme, so hopefully we could answer them by theme. Thank you, Olivia. Olivia Tackler, our chief of our plan formulation branch. Great. Does anybody have a comment card they haven't given anybody yet? Just raise it up and we'll come collect it.
See if this works. So I'll also add, if you flip your card over, it has a mailing address. If you think of a comment later and you want to mail it in, you can add a stamp to that and send it to us, and that'll come directly to me at our offices that aren't too far from here.
So I'll go through these comments and our team will provide answers. This first comment, can shapefiles for alternatives and features be released for the public to use? It may be helpful for individuals who utilize mapping services to be able to download and then overlay other shapefiles to visualize different perspectives.
Can you share shapefiles? We have gotten a request to share shapefiles. Some of the data that we have is that's in our GIS analysis is somebody else's copyrighted data. So we need to evaluate how easily it is to share that information out. So we've gotten a request. We are looking to figure out how best to accommodate, but we don't know the answer to that question yet because it gets a bit involved with the different information. With the 4,000 pages of report that we have, there's a lot of information we need to go through. But we've gotten a request. We don't know the best answer to that request yet, but we're looking to see what information can be shared back out.
Thanks, Bryce. This next question concerns climate. The question is, the changing climate is dynamic. How is Army Corps going to ensure whatever is authorized will be sufficient for a long-term protection plan? Talk more about adaptability in the plan. And the second follow-up to this is planned retreat from any areas? Is planned retreat from any areas included in the planning scope? If not, why, and should it be?
I think the first question kind of in a nutshell was talking about adaptability of the plan. And that's something that's being considered right now at this phase of study, but definitely an area we want to develop more. But in general, we're looking at right now, most of the information you've seen on the screen today in terms of cost and benefits was in reference to our 50-year economic period of analysis, but we're also considering 100 years out, since we recognize that these structures will be in place for a very long time. So in terms of the shore-based measures, we've considered adaptability in terms of height. So in the future, if certain sea level rise scenarios play out, these structures can be retrofitted to be more substantial in height and hence flood risk reduction. And then for the barriers, looking at different scenarios, one of them would be different open and closure operations, essentially. You know, but yeah, absolutely, it's something that we're considering at this stage of the study, but definitely an area that we need more research and will get more attention as we move along. And I'm going to pass the microphone to Bryce to address the planned retreat scenario.
So we've looked at, that's a non-structural type approach. We have looked at non-structural in a lot of the study area, particularly the areas of unaddressed risk as it is in the various alternatives that we have laid out. But it's been very difficult to justify economically, and that's largely, we think, due to the very high urbanization that exists within the area, the space requirements that you need to be able to lift the structure, just the technical feasibility of being able to lift the structure. For example, a brownstone in Brooklyn is just not something that you can do that to. So managed retreat does involve, there are voluntary managed retreat efforts that have been done subsequent to Hurricane Sandy. Those are, like I say, voluntary, so it's not so much a managed, more of a voluntary retreat that's been done. But there's a lot of social issues that come into play when you're talking about basically disassembling a community and relocating it elsewhere. And then there's, of course, then you're having development elsewhere and the impacts associated with that. But it is something that, as I mentioned, we have a framework right now, so we are looking at if there are areas where those type of non-structural approaches can be feasible in our plan. We're looking to fill out that framework that we have with those features. So it's not off the table, but it's been very difficult so far to justify economically and for some of those other factors that I mentioned.
This comment has 3 questions. We'll take them one at a time. Why is the economic period of analysis different from the planning horizon?
Okay, so that's a great question. Whoever made that question has an eagle eye to see that the two are different. It basically comes down to Army Corps policy. We're required to look at a 50-year period analysis for our economic analysis. That's just in our guidance what we're required by. We're required by other guidance to look at a longer horizon of 100 years to look at climate adaptation, right? We know that things don't disappear or a project doesn't cease to function after 50 years, so we're required by different guidance to look at a 100-year period for the climate adaptation, but the economic period of analysis, where we count those costs and benefits that Bryce told us about, is only limited to that 50 year. So basically it comes down to our guidance.
If I could just add on to that too. In our 50-year period of analysis, the Corps has what we refer to as a discount factor, which is basically a depreciation that's given over time, or a discounting, a better term. So with a 50-year period of analysis, it basically, the discount factor gives greater emphasis to costs that are spent early, achieving benefits that are reaped early or achieved early in the planning process. So you have a lot of years of benefits. And as the years go past, if you have to spend costs further out in the future, and for that matter benefits, those get discounted so they don't affect so much in our overall evaluation. So to look beyond 50 years, we can, but with the discount factor, it really doesn't affect the evaluation so much because there is an emphasis on trying to build projects quickly and to get the benefits achieved as early as possible. So that is embedded within that, how we do our economics evaluations. And so while it is limited, as Danielle mentioned, to that 50-year period of analysis, it wouldn't change much for that discount factor if it was extended out further. But with the planning horizon, looking out 100 years, we do like that, the longer term adaptation and having our projects be effectively permanent structures.
Thanks, Danielle and Bryce.
There were 3 questions?
There are The other two concern induced flooding, which Karen Bauer is going to read a section of comments related to that, so we'll save those for that section. These final three that I have here concern natural and nature-based features. I'll take them one at a time. The first question is, how will the BCR be adjusted as NNBFs, or natural and nature-based features, are incorporated into the plan? Can you estimate BCR for NNBFs as a standalone solution in the absence of structural features of 3D or the future TSP?
Is it on? There. The benefit cost ratio is about 2.5 on the plan that we currently have outlined, as I showed. And that's primarily looking at the damages to the structures. As we move forward, to the extent that we can add in any additional features or measures to our plan, whether it be natural and nature-based features, non-structural features, other structural measures that are designed to a different degree other than the 1% design event that I mentioned, we would be glad to do so. It only helps improve the overall net benefits, every additional measure that you can incorporate into it. We don't have natural and nature-based features in our plan because a lot of natural and nature-based features, with the exception of beach nourishment or a reinforced dune type structure, really don't apply much to the severe coastal storm events. They're just too embedded within the environment, either oyster beds beneath the water column. They do help, and they work very well for the more frequent flood events, where you might have a marsh next to an upland area where that marsh can attenuate and address those smaller surges and wave impacts from the more frequent storms. But for that reason, we haven't identified them yet, but we do look to infuse our plan, if you will, with additional, with these natural and nature-based features where they are feasible. That being said, given the urbanization of this area, there are limitations on what areas where they might be applied, but we have identified some of those areas that might work as part of our Hudson-Raritan estuary study that was recently completed, and it identified a number of sites that might have that potential, so we are looking at those, as well as any other ideas that people might have for doing them, but obvious areas that have a lot of ecological resources now, like Jamaica Bay or the Hackensack Meadows, are perfect candidate areas. We're trying to identify those measures, and we're looking to add those into the plan as we go forward.
Related to this, a commenter writes, the White House recently announced green infrastructure investments and priorities, including cost-benefit analysis. How will this be included in this plan?
I can speak generally to that. So that's newer guidance. I hate to be the one talking about guidance again, but I'll go into it. So that's newer guidance that the Army Corps doesn't yet have specific guidance on. So certainly something we're tracking, and we're looking forward to getting new guidance from our higher headquarters, but we do not yet have specific guidance about how to implement that. Those directives coming from the White House for this study or any study that the Army Corps is currently doing.
And this comment is related to natural nature-based features in the context of the environmental impact statement. They ask, how is it possible that the Corps will equally analyze and potentially incorporate non-structural and natural and nature-based features into the plan if we're currently in a draft EIS and next phase is final EIS? Final EIS Tier 1 is a final decision, and if the final EIS only includes structural measures, then there isn't any availability to include NNDF as a standalone solution.
It's on. Okay. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit, so hopefully you can hear me. So right now at this stage of the study, the structural measures have been assessed at this draft level, while the natural and nature-based features and non-structural measures are being further refined and designed. And so the structural measures kind of start off the conversation of if any of these structural measures that are included in any of the alternatives are not environmentally acceptable, then those are kind of like the larger more concrete pieces of the EIS, and then the NNPS and non-structural supplement the alternatives. So those are going to be incorporated in this stage, and they will be presented in the final, but that doesn't, the final tier 1 is not the final. The tier 2 is the final, so there will be multiple opportunities in the future to comment on natural and nature-based features and the non-structural pieces of the alternative plans in the tier 2.
And how does the Army Corps evaluate non-structural solutions in NNBS compared to hardened infrastructure? Restoring areas along the coastline to their natural state, i.e. living with the water, would in the long term be the most cost-effective and flood risk reducing solution? Does USACE consider buyouts and NNBS equally as structural? I think that some of this has been touched on with the answer to managed retreat and these answers to NNBS, but I want to give the opportunity to add to anything that you've said already.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. All of these things that Jesse mentioned that are in the comment, and it is a very good comment, they're all tools in the toolbox, right? Structural measures like levees and flood walls, non-structural measures like home elevations and buyouts, and natural nature-based features like wetland creation or restoration. These are all just tools in the toolbox of coastal storm risk management. So these are things that the study team is considering everything. We haven't yet discounted anything yet. We haven't, we've screened some just based on knowing what the conditions look like in certain neighborhoods and certain stretches of the waterfront. It wouldn't, doesn't make sense to do certain things in certain areas, again, just based on existing information. But we haven't said just wholesale, we're not considering natural nature-based features, or we're not considering non-structural or whatever. These are all just tools in the toolbox that we're considering.
All right, our next question is, why is this presentation not hybrid for the broadest possible public involvement?
That's a great question, and a great suggestion to look into how to do hybrid meetings in the future. We held a series of 3 virtual meetings back in September and October of this year. So we're looking to do more virtual meetings, more in-person meetings, and we'll certainly look into hybrid meetings as well. We're also looking to post a recorded presentation on the website, so that's a resource available to folks. And then certainly, if anybody, just changing gears a little bit, if anybody has any ideas that is included in any groups that would like a presentation, whether it be virtual, in-person, or hybrid, the study team is certainly interested in meeting with your group. I think we've done about 2-3 dozen meetings during the comment period already with groups, so please don't be shy about reaching out to us and requesting a meeting.
Can you expand upon the Army Corps' understanding of the other constructed and ongoing projects assumed as part of the future baseline condition at Coney Island? Is this reference to the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation Boardwalk Rehabilitation Study / design? Can you expand upon the Army Corps' understanding of other constructed and ongoing projects assumed as part of the future baseline condition at Coney Island?
Thank you. So yes, we do have a project that was built there. It was actually started in construction. I want to say it's been amended a few times subsequently back. Started initially back in the 1990s. It stretches the public access area of Coney Island Beach. It's been amended by having additional measures going around Seagate community since then. So it's that whole long stretch of that existing beach nourishment project that we have as part of our assumed future without project condition being in place. I don't know offhand, and I apologize for this, the level of the design event for that existing project versus our current 1% flood event that we're using for our common evaluation purposes in this project. But we do assume that project to be in place. We do assume along much of that boardwalk area to have an elevated promenade type feature to it, but that, again, that's an initial proposal for that area, maybe a reinforced dune structure similar to what's being done on Rockaway Peninsula, Rockaway Beach might be more appropriate for that area. It's just our initial understanding, but that project, as well as all those other projects that I showed, as well as dozens and dozens of other more localized projects that have been done on various critical infrastructure in the region, subsequent by Hurricane Sandy, by our agency and a number of other federal and state local agencies, have been assumed in our Future Without Project condition and are described in our cumulative analysis section.
I would like to know about heavy rains and impact that could happen after the gates are closed. You could have heavy rains for days before the storm surge arrives.
But that'll, maybe tag team first. Okay. Kick off. So I believe the question was concerning rainfall in combination with coastal storms. So at this phase of the study, we have addressed that issue to some extent. When we build our coastal storm risk management projects, or plan, engineer, and design them, we have to consider the interior, and we call that interior drainage. So if there's some rainfall that occurs, say while these gates are closed, or as these walls are built, there's measures in place to offset damages that might occur from the interior. So in this study, those costs have been estimated at a very high level by comparing similar projects to the basin size. To estimate pump station capacity, number of gravity outlets needed, things of that nature. So the issue of compound flooding, is somewhat addressed in that analysis, in the interior drainage analysis. However, there is some further study that needs to be addressed with extreme rainfall events occurring in combination with extreme coastal storms. Bryce, maybe if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I don't have, the only point we have looked at and incorporated interior drainage costs as Arun just described. We also did look at the coincidence that occurs in coastal storms from rainfall and its impacts in the region versus the storm surge that comes into it. Now, certainly in some areas, they're much more flashy and can be prone to flood risk far quicker. The post-tropical depression, Ida, illustrated that very well in some areas within the study area last year. But we did find that more typically with coastal storms, particularly those with bad storm surges, there is a little bit of a phase difference or a delay in when the flooding impacts occur in the area versus when the storm surges hit. For example, with Hurricane Irene in the year before Hurricane Sandy in 2011, that had a very high rainfall event associated with it. And that rainfall occurred and discharged into the study area hours, if not more than that, after the storm surge had entered the area and left. So there is a bit of a phasing difference between the two. But we are looking at that, and there are authorities available to us for evaluating inland flooding and interior drainage further as part of the study. But right now, coastal storm surge, being a coastal storm risk management study, by far poses the greatest flood risk to the vast urbanized area. And Hurricane Sandy kind of demonstrated that well by doing the tens of billions of damage that it did overnight.
Thank you. Along the same lines, and just paraphrasing in case you want to add any more, how do damage risks change when considering cloudburst modeling and inland flooding? Storm surges are not our only threats. How does this address rainfall flooding? Does it address combined sewer overflow? Anything else?
Yeah, maybe just a little addition. Yeah, in referencing interior drainage again, if you check out that appendix, it's a sub-appendix of engineering appendix B. I can't recall off the top of my head which one that is right now. CSOs are considered there, at least the cost to divert and to pump CSOs out in vulnerable areas that might be impacted by the building of a barrier or a flood wall or something of that nature. So that's assessed, as everything in the study at a high level at this point, but the costs that we have now do consider what would need to be done to divert CSOs out of a vulnerable area.
I'd like to add that too, just to say that it's the coastal storm risk management mission that we have basically deals with coastal storm risks, flood risks, as they affect open water channels and water bodies. When it comes to the limitations of interior drainage systems, combined sewer overflows, wastewater treatment plants, things that involve more pipes within a city, that kind of is more in the municipal realm of authority and responsibility. So we try to assess the flood risk as they affect into the open channel areas, creeks, drainage ditches, and then of course the open water bodies. But there is a little bit of a borderline in our agency's purview and mission versus the more local responsibilities in terms of the stormwater collection and drainage systems. So some impacts we unfortunately are kind of beyond what we have within our scope.
Existing coastal resilience proposals such as Hunts Point, Forward Plan, DEP, Green Infrastructure Plan, etc., have to be incorporated into the chosen alternatives, especially in EJ communities with the greatest residual risk, i.e. most of the Bronx. More to come.
So, that's a great point. So what the study team does when looking at the future is we consider other coastal resiliency projects that have either been constructed or in the works to be constructed. We know the scope of a lot of those projects is different and also the status. So we've seen a lot of work since Hurricane Sandy in the region, right? And so a lot of work has been constructed, but there's a lot of plans out there on the book. So the study team had to choose a cutoff point because some things are pie in the sky, conceptual, not funded, not permitted. Other things are designed, permitted, but not constructed. So what we did was we chose a cutoff date of January of 2023, and we said anything that is not funded or constructed by that, funded or permitted by that date, we're going to decide not to include in a future condition because those things may not be ultimately constructed more so than things that are permitted and funded for construction. So we just chose a cutoff date. That's typically what we do for our Army Corps study. So we're tracking things that are in the planning phase that have not yet been permitted or funded for constructed as things that may get permitted or funded for construction in the future, and we may incorporate into what we know about the future, but for right now, we chose that January 2023 cutoff date.
Thank you. We have to live with flood walls every day. How will you design them so that they are a benefit in terms of psychological and emotional impact, not just a concrete wall?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Ted?
We have to live with flood walls every day. How will you design them so they are a benefit in terms of psychological and emotional impact, not just a concrete wall? A related question is, can we ask that a wall shown on posters outside for CDI along West Street be sensitive to the location and include plants and people-friendly design? You will get major pushback for a cement wall from all stakeholders looking for resiliency for a better idea is first.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I'll start from the end about better ideas. If you have better ideas for the proposed plan in your community, we certainly want to hear about those things. I think the beginning of the comment was, how do you live with a concrete flood wall in your neighborhood, and the social or psychological impacts. Some people think flood walls are not the right word maybe, but aesthetically pleasing perhaps, and we know that people value the view of the waterfront, they value their parks, the waterfront parks, I live by Brooklyn Bridge Park. I know it's not West Fourth, but I know the park there. And I go there almost every day, and I certainly wouldn't want to see a concrete flood wall where a wetland used to be, right? So these are the ideas that we want to hear from you and the values that you have when it comes to what you want to see in your community and how you interact with the waterfront. As it pertains to psychological impacts of the flooding, I'm not a psychologist, but I do understand whoever put the comment in, you know, living with a flood wall, you know, that's a little tough because I know, you know, there are pros and cons to living with coastal flood risk management project in your backyard. You know, you might not value a flood wall or something structural during the sunny day, but certainly before a storm or after a storm, you might appreciate a little more after your community may be impacted by a storm. So there are pros and cons to each, and I'm not saying that to discount what the commenter put, but maybe this is a discussion to have after the presentation here. Please find me or anybody here. I think we'd all be really interested to know where you're coming from.
And I'm just anxious to jump in, I'll talk loud. We have similar projects that have flood walls in New Jersey, in Greenbrook. And as we designed those, we reached out to the community and said, the flood wall's the right answer, it's the best answer to protect the community. How can we make this flood wall not a big, ugly, gray wall? And they had a lot of input in, so it's not just a flat wall, it actually has inundations into it that create more of a pattern, a more aesthetically pleasing pattern. They choose the color. We ensure that it's able to be graffiti resistant, and just trying to create those effects to make it more look like a nice perimeter wall, not an ugly gray wall. And the other thing that we're reaching out, we have a agency called ERDIX that does a lot of our scientific analysis to come up with new ideas. And you know, I joke with them all the time. You know, one thing I need you to make me is a transparent seawall. All right, they're working on it. All right, they're not there. But the reality is there are elements out there where there are pieces where you could build a seawall that only goes up halfway and then has pylons that as the storm approaches, they can add sections to it to get it to its elevation. So there are technologies out there that we will look to incorporate as we do this, because nobody wants a big ugly gray seawall. And yes, we want it when it's flooding, but the rest of the time we like our community without big walls. And so we're looking for those opportunities, and anybody who's got some solid research on some good ideas on how to achieve the same defense that a wall provides while making it more aesthetically pleasing, we are wide open to ideas.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Is the park and
The plan that we have here is a framework. It can be changed, it can be enhanced, it can be improved. And it's your feedback that will help do that and get to a solution that might be workable to that end. But you know, at the end of the day, if it's not supported by the community, if it's not supported by the elected officials, it won't get built if it's not supported by the non-federal sponsors. So this is an initial outline to try to address those severe risks. There are a lot more features that we need to add to our plan. But you know, ultimately, it's a decision of the community and the elected officials that represent you as to what actually gets implemented. It's not our decision. All we do is make a recommendation to Congress, and then it's in your elected officials' hands as to what they get, as to what they authorize for construction and then fund.
And then one thing I'll add, because I like incorporating people to solve the challenge. One of the biggest challenges we have with all these projects is real estate. Okay, and we are in a highly dense urban environment, and seawalls are attractive because the footprint of them is very small. You know, levees, much larger of a footprint. That means we're impinging on many landowners' property, and that becomes very challenging and expensive. So that is one of the challenges that we have to face is getting around that real estate challenge. So.
Thank you, sir. Because adaptation of structural features like the barriers, flood walls, etc., means building them higher, when would that decision be made so as not to be simply reactive to high damage storm events?
Yeah, so this question relates to adaptation again, and it sounded like when will it happen? And as with some other projects such as Rockaway, another one we're working on South Shore Staten Island, adaptation triggers have been established, monitoring sea level rise changes either through data NOAA produces, and developing the appropriate adaptation trigger for the particular project. So I can't give you a number or a time, or a year right now, but that's, in a nutshell, how we evaluate something like that. And these, the walls being built higher, is one thing, but then also keep in mind that there's a number of gated structures and major gated structures throughout this project. So we also have to look at, as water level rises, what's the appropriate time to maybe change the operation of such gate. So just wanted to remind the audience of that as well. Did you guys have anything else to add? Or?
So first a statement, then a question. We're very concerned about issues like combined sewer overflow, Superfund cleanups, and what proposed measures will look like for our community. Question, will there be any additional information released before the comment period deadline relating to modeling, visuals, or anything else?
Yeah, so I don't think, so the information that we have right now is posted online for the draft feasibility reports. I don't anticipate additional modeling being done for this particular report, but perhaps in future phases of the study, more information about that will be released and shared as we have it. So, one important thing to keep in mind when looking at these engineering features, is that developing cost estimates was really a primary goal from that perspective, so we can get conversations started, so we can understand if we have the benefit cost ratio, the net benefits that we need to move forward with a particular plan. So, in that, keeping that in mind, the interior drainage cost estimates and dealing with CSOs. It's just been looked at a very high level to develop cost estimates. So the behavior and the impact of combined sewer overflows, things of that nature, will not be included in this report, but hopefully we can have some of that information down the road.
Why aren't you considering the ARM, rapid Arctic melting scenario? Why aren't you considering the rapid Arctic melting scenario?
If you want to. Yeah, go ahead.
So the ARM scenario, for those who might not be familiar, is call it the highest of the high sea level change projection that a lot of scientists are using in their climate projections. I believe the state of New York and the city of New York use both in their sea level change projections, right? So it's part of the climate science, and it's something that we're considering. I think Bryce had that slide that shows all the different sea level change projections that are being considered as part of the study. I will say that the Army Corps, the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, and the city of New York all use the same climate science, right? So we just have different projections based on that basis science, right? So it's something that we're tracking, we're considering, and hopefully we're communicating well. In the report, it's Appendix B of the report. The engineering appendix has a lot of information on that if you'd like to know more about that. Check out the presentation after we post it online. Arun, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's okay. I mean, if you just recall, you know, the slide we have up during the presentation, one of the many, we had a number of climate scenarios on there. You know, and currently this study is being formulated under that intermediate sea level rise scenario, 50 years out, and then considering an adaptation horizon of 100. We've also looked at more extreme situations on a preliminary level. So, you know, that intermediate sea level rise scenario gets you about, you know, 2 feet more water, you know, on top of the extreme storm surge as it's presented in this study. You know, but we've also looked at scenarios of 3, 4, 5 as well to understand, you know, what can be the impact of those situations and what will need to be done to reduce risk against those scenarios.
Thank you. The coastal flooding and induced flooding measures shown are very reductive engineering solutions. Will the Army Corps be doing the final design, or will design consultants be engaged? Will the Army Corps be the client or local jurisdictions? The Lower Manhattan Financial District Resiliency Plan is a better example of a combined urban design / landscape / engineering design approach.
Can you read that one again?
Sure. The coastal flooding and induced flooding measures shown are very reductive or simple. Will the Army Corps be doing the final designs, or will design consultants be engaged? Will the Army Corps or the client be the client or local jurisdictions?
Okay.
So they are fairly simple layouts that we have now, very conceptual, very high level. And that's because we have these 5 alternatives, which are so broad spectrum. We really need to figure out which one can be supported in advance for doing more deep dive and getting a lot more detail in it. When it comes to the end of our study in 2024, we make a recommendation to Congress. That's done in the Chief of Engineers report, which is a very summarized, very slimmed down version of what our final report is. So it refers to the final report, but it won't have a lot of the details that you would see of a project as it's in this urbanized area before it was actually implemented. A lot of those details, given our current planning process, would be done during our pre-construction engineering design phase following the study. So right now, we may not be able to get to that level of specificity. We may not be able to get to that level of specificity in the study at all. A lot of that might be done during the design phase, but we do recognize that, you know, these are concepts of we need to do something in this area, we think. We don't know the exact location, we don't know the exact height, we don't know the exact type of measure, but we think something should be done in this area. And to that end, the most important thing that comes out of our feasibility studies is the cost estimate that we give to Congress, because that's what they give to us in their construction authorization. The Corps generally authorizes, Congress writes their authorization bills to say the Corps is authorized to build this plan, this project that you generally described, and it can be changed after this point within some limits at this cost. And that's the main thing that comes out of the construction authorization, is that this is what that project can spend to be built. And that's the constraint that we have to then work within. And it's for that reason that the cost that we showed here tonight of those first costs, for example, in alternative 3B with its $52.7 billion first cost estimate, fully 1/3 of that cost is just contingency, because there's so many unknowns and so many various enhancements or improvements or changes that might be made to all these various features and all these various locations that are in that plan. So we're looking to try to nail down, instead of having 5 alternatives on the table, hopefully having one, being able to deep dive into it more, give more details to it, come up with a much better cost estimate, much better layout, much better description of what would be the design event for that gets the greatest bang for the buck, what would be the operational conditions for those stone surge gates, so that when you make that recommendation to Congress, which has some latitude in terms of its general description, the cost estimate that's associated with it is at least good and can accomplish what we have outlined in that general plan.
Thank you. Can you talk more about how this study will help the flooding from the Hudson River and in Westchester? How come that area isn't more of a priority?
Hey Karen?
Yes.
Before the panel answers that question, I'd like to thank everybody for their patience because we've gone well over. It's 4:39. So the team will need time to prepare for the next session at 6. I'm going to suggest that we do 2 more questions and then we'll answer the remaining questions via correspondence, via email. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia.
Karen, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Can you talk more about how this study will help the flooding from the Hudson River and in Westchester? How come that area isn't more of a priority?
So we have looked in the Westchester area, and we do have a number of other projects that are being done there in some of the more fluvial or river-based flooding events. There aren't a lot of areas that are more prone to the coastal storm risk damages from storm surge that we've seen so far. But as I mentioned earlier, we are going to going back as we proceed with whatever plan is advanced in the study, to reevaluate a lot of these shoreline areas that still have those unaddressed coastal storm risks, to see if there's some other level of measure or if there's some other types of measures that might be feasible and workable in those areas. But if there are areas of particular experienced coastal storm risk that we aren't aware of, where you think something might be feasible, please write us and let us know. We'd be more than happy to try to look at that again as part of that reevaluation as the study proceeds.
All right, last 2 questions. When will you share your revised strategic communication plan or community engagement plan moving forward?
So that's, just so everybody understands, we have a strategic communication plan. It was developed at the request or direction of our higher authority offices. And it's been done typically on our mega city type projects. It's typically an internal document of our strategy for how to get best, not just communication with different external groups and the public, but also just internally between our agency and other agencies. So it's kind of a broad spectrum document. It's not something we typically share out or necessarily revise. We did have comments on it from a variety of non-governmental organizations that we've been trying to coordinate with it to assist in our outreach efforts on this draft report. But it is a living document, I should say, and it is also constantly being revised based on the meetings that we have, the different things that we've learned. So we're looking to take and incorporate that information that we got, the feedback that we've gotten on that document, but to the extent that it's something that's useful for being released, we certainly would make that available as we update it, as we go along with the public review process. But it's not something that we revise day to day, but it just kind of as needed as the study goes along. So we'll be looking to share that out.
Mid-January.
There you go.
We will share the next version, okay, living document. I'm making changes to it just by being here and adding notes to the thing. So it's constantly being developed, but we'll have a new draft out in mid-January. No pressure.
And this is related. Same question for the promised Tax Environment and Climate Justice Working Group. When we get the plan for that.
So do you want to take, I see you.
No.
That's part of the strategic.
That one, is that the group that we're working with? Is that the?
Yeah, from Columbia University.
What was the question?
Same, okay. When will you share your revised HATS Environment and Climate Justice Working Group? When will we get the plan for that?
I don't know what that's asking.
We are working, the goal is to be working in collaboration with that group to develop what that group looks like and how it will go forward, and we plan on having routine meetings with them to develop that together.
And that is it for our question and answer session. Thank you very much all for your time. And if we did not answer your questions or you want clarification, please reach out, either email us, call us, or come talk to us. Thank you.
And I'll be around too. I don't know all the answers to the technical